Now that we've got one row rendering out for the single request we have, we can continue working on our request row component. Inside of request row, we're going to want to make sure that we pull a couple of different properties off of our individual request and attempt to show them on the actual table. Now remember here's the documentation for our table component. So each request row that we create has to return a table.row, and inside of it will be a couple of table.cells. So let's first get started inside of our request row component by importing semantic UI, and we'll place these different components to represent the row and each individual cell. All right, so back over inside of request row, at the very top, I'm going to import table from semantic UI React. Then down inside of my render method, I'm going to do the same thing I did before inside of our request index component, where we destructured only the actual components off of table that we cared about. So in this case, we probably only care about row and cell off of that table object. And then rather than returning a div from this thing, we can instead return a row, like so. Inside of the row component is going to be a collection of different cells, where each cell represents one different property of a request. Let's go review our mockup really quick, just to remember what every row is or what every cell we want to show. So the first one is going to be an ID. You will recall that we do not actually have anything called an ID tied to any one of our actual requests here. So this ID property, you might be wondering what this column for is exactly. Well, ID is supposed to be the index of an individual request inside of our request array. So really, we are taking its index inside that array as representing its ID. That's really the only unique identifying piece of information that we know that we'll always be guaranteed to have. At this point, however, we have not passed down the request index into this request row component. So if we go back over to our request index component and find the render rows function right here, I'm going to make sure that I take the index of each individual request out of the request array, and I'm going to just make sure that I pass that down as an additional prop called ID, like so. So again, the index of request inside this array is going to represent its ID. So now back inside of request row, I can take my props object, I'm going to place a cell, and inside of it, inside of a set of curly braces, I'll reference this.props.id. And I'll save both these files, so both the index.js file and the requestrow.js file as well. And we'll test this out inside the browser. So back over at my application, I now see a cell here of 0 because the first request that we have will always have an index of 0. So this is definitely the correct ID in this case. Now that we've got the correct ID appearing, we'll move on to our next property, which is supposed to be the description of an individual request. For this, we need to access the request object that we pass down into this component through props. So back over inside of our render rows function, recall that we passed down the individual request as a prop called request. So now down inside of request row, we can place a new cell. Inside of it, we'll reference this.props.request.description, like so. And now if we save this file as well and flip back over to the browser, we should see our description appear. Very good. All right, I think that we've got a good pattern here going, and we definitely know at least how to get the next couple of cells on here as well. Now, before we start to fill in those additional cells, I want you to take notice of how we are going to be probably referencing this.props a couple of times inside this render method. So rather than writing out this.props very repetitively throughout this render method, I think we should do a little bit of destructuring here. So I'll say ID and request are going to come from this.props, like so. And now we can shorten these two expressions to be simply ID and request.description. Okay, that looks pretty good. Now let's get back to our table. So the next cell that we want to display on the screen is our amount. Now on the table, this column is labeled amount, but you will recall that as tied to an individual request, we are calling that property or the amount of money that we want to send along with it the value property. So when we place the next cell here, it's not going to be request.amount, it will be request.value. Remember that if at any point in time you forget the different properties that are tied to an individual struct, you can always go back to our campaign file, the campaign contract itself, and get a quick reminder of the different properties that are tied to a struct. So right now, if I open up my campaign.sol file, I can always look at my request right here, and you'll see that, yep, we call that thing value, not amount. All right, let's make sure that the value is showing up inside the browser as well. All right, now when I go back, you'll notice that it's a very large number here. So remember, whenever we store the value on a request, we are storing it in terms of way. We probably don't want to have way showing up on this table right here. Instead, we probably want to show it in terms of ether. So I think we should import our Web3 library and use that helper function on it to convert this into an ether value instead of way. So back inside of request row, I'll import web3 from, and this is going to be our web3.js file right here. So it's going to be .. Ethereum web3. And then rather than just printing out request.value right here, we can say web3.utils.from way. We'll pass in request.value, and then as the second argument, we'll tell it that we want it to be printed out in terms of ether. And then don't forget the closing parenthesis right here as well. So now if we save this, we should see a much more reasonable 0.001 printed out on the screen. Cool, so that looks a lot better. All right, now there's just one more property I want to take care of, and then we're going to take a short break. So this is going to be the recipient property, which is going to be the address of the person we want to send this money to. So this one is going to be pretty straightforward. This is going to be, again, cell, and we'll do request.recipient, like so. And yep, there's our address. Okay, I think that we've gotten through a lot of content here. So let's take a quick pause, and then we're going to start finishing off these other columns in the next video.